and standardization of urban products, there's also this increased codification and increased procedural requirements placed on planning design. So this is the kind of definition of checklist urbanism. So whether it's New York City's 8-stage uniform land use review procedure or the 12-step Green Building Council LEED approval, it's where urban planning design is immersed in a sea of checklists that preemptively dictate the scale, scope, character, and of every urban project undertaken. And so not to discredit the goals of these programs, but to make the point that urbanistic design today is unable to innovate because, or it's much more difficult to innovate because of the burden placed on it by regulatory regimes intended to improve the quality or value of a project. You know, we all know some projects desperately need this kind of checklist, but these safeguards also diminish innovative thinking. Let's see, so take I guess there's one more example. These checklists often produce a false sense of accomplishment upon completion. It's what the University of London professor of geography, John Adams, calls compulsive risk assessment psychosis, or CRAP. So consider the current state of the Tappan Zee Bridge. This bridge is described as a disaster in slow motion. It was intentionally built fast and cheap 50 years ago and is falling apart other than constant and continuous survey and repair. And it could collapse at any moment, like the I-35 bridge, without this oversight. 13 years after a replacement was first discussed, this bridge is still in the draft environmental review process, evaluating 5 alternatives, including the do nothing option. So the irony is significant. We're enamored with risk, but our inability to work expediently increases the likelihood of catastrophe. So in summary, innovation in urban formatting is implicitly discouraged because of the cumbersome regulatory structures implemented under the guise of protectionism. They're incapable of accurately evaluating new or unknown quantities.
Which leads to the sort of last category or last characteristic of contemporary American urbanism, which is this idea of one-trick urbanism. Despite an urban future that looks increasingly characterized by limited resources and even more limited investment capital, it's perhaps astonishing that we continue to ask our urban infrastructural systems to do just one thing. The same thing that in most cases they've been doing for over a century. Possibilities of multiplicity and redundancy, so prevalent in early ideas about these systems. You look at the national highway system and some of the early ideas for what that would be, have been abandoned for what Keller Easterling calls a frozen shape, a dumb network with dumb switches. Urbanistic planning and design in the US over the last half century has been culturally programmed to look past potentials for hybridization and urbanism beyond the ubiquitous mixed use. So we would rather spend $500 million to do one thing than $550 million to get 2, 3, 4, or 5 things. Bundling, mixing, laminating, and multiplying have all been excised from urbanistic thinking. So what do we do? Do we complain? Are we the architect or the designer in the corner who says no one is doing anything, no one's listening to us? We don't necessarily think so, and so what we'd like to do is sort of lay out 4 aspects of praxis that we think can actually engage this situation, not in a way of denying it, but actually looking for opportunities embedded within it. So the first idea is this notion of leveraging urban latencies, and I think we've actually seen quite a bit of these kind of examples today. And so the idea is rooted in a fundamental notion of ours that urbanism, regardless of how it's designed, aspirations towards total efficiency and lightness of touch, inevitably produces waste of some sort. It can be physical, it can be environmental, it can be social, it can be cultural. But more often than not, it's cited as the failure of the system. And design, unfortunately, tends to focus on the mitigation or excision of these waste products rather than their urbanistic potential. So we'd prefer to consider these byproducts as opportunities rather than limitations if considered properly. The point is that if past urban futures relied on utopian impossibilities and technological novelty, the visions we are advocating emerge from the leveraging of hidden, unexpected, hyperbolic realities and existing patterns of urbanization, or what Jim Corner had described more than a decade ago, defining a milieu that stages the conditions for the emergence of new realities. So rather than importing formal solutions and superimposed patterns that in an isolated form, We would rather look for an act that elucidates locally unique areas of potential and agency. In essence, looking for a point of leverage that enhances and amplifies a given situation.
Okay, so one project of ours we'll go through that kind of addresses this is this was a competition entry we put together a couple years ago for the UCLA City Lab WPA 2.0, which was intended to look at infrastructure in the United States and try to bring the voice of designers back into the discourse for how infrastructure could be built in the 21st century, as there was all this attention toward the National Recovery and Reinvestment Act. So rather than rebuilding existing infrastructures or developing energy sources or natural disaster prevention, we tried to think of a way that we could attempt to bundle public realm with infrastructure, but specifically by looking at existing infrastructures and how to colonize the kind of perceived waste or byproducts of this. So we started thinking about carbon emissions in the United States, and this is showing what 14% of this globally comes from automobiles. We started looking at point source of CO2 emissions in urban environments. So we have, I guess this is showing coal. Well, we identified 3 particular areas that potentially you could have a kind of contained source of CO2 in the urban environment that would be able to be controlled or harnessed. So you have coal power plants, you have underwater vehicle tunnels, which we considered that kind of a CO2 container underground, and then we were even trying to look at toll booths, but we got away from that one. So the purpose of looking at this, so algae love CO2. And so we wanted to, they're one of the most robust classifications of life on Earth. They consume CO2. They are found on all 7 continents. And so we thought, what if we could somehow colonize these point sources of CO2 within the urban environment with algae biofuel production or bioreactors? So back to the underwater tunnels, there are 18 of these, or 19 of these over 2,000 feet in the United States. And we settled in on the Brooklyn Battery Tunnel because it is the longest in North America. It handles 51,000 vehicle trips per day and evacuates more than 26 million cubic pounds of CO2 per year. And so this diagram begins to show a typical tunnel condition in the upper left, where you have this underwater tunnel or underground tunnel that's this contained source of CO2. It's constantly being ventilated and exhausted through one kind of ventilation stack. And we thought if we could somehow attach a rigid bladder to this ventilation stack, we could contain and condense CO2 so that we could control its release to an algae bioreactor, which we're showing on the right. We were particularly drawn to underwater vehicle tunnels because of how integrated they are into existing urban environments. We thought they'd be a great place to test how we could bundle public realm and infrastructure, as opposed to a coal power plant out necessarily in the middle of nowhere. So this is our floating pod version of an algae bioreactor that would link to these expanded waterfront bladders. And then because this bladder can take on many shapes, we were introducing this new public realm typology on top of the bladder that became a pier or a waterfront. And these sections on the right begin to show how the bladder could be formally manipulated in order to adapt for different programs or uses or landscapes, while all at the same time containing CO2 and delivering it to the bioreactors. This is a blow-up of these sections showing some terraces and plantings and all the little CO2 inside the bladder. And so it was an ideas competition, and we produced the most spectacular version of this we could. So we took the Governor's Island exhaust ventilation stack that currently exists and attached a, 2,500 foot pivoting pier that essentially becomes a minute hand across New York Harbor, connecting Brooklyn to Governor's Island and to Lower Manhattan. That would maybe be your morning commute, and that you knew where it was going to be based upon the time of the day, and that it would have the potential to transform this area of New York. So ultimately you get this large-scale algal farm that doubles as an extraordinary urban park, replete with structured wetlands, aquatic and avian habitat, recreation amenities like swimming pools and fishing piers and high-speed bike lanes and public promenades. And this piece of infrastructure and public realm is 1 part climate action, 1 part agricultural production, 1 part ecological preserve, 1 part public realm, and 1 part economic catalyst. So the next, the second element that we were talking about, find out my notes, is this, we're advocating a kind of renewed valuing of actionable design speculation at the metropolitan scale. So as noted before, the urban visions of the kind of mid-century planning initiatives relied upon an overbearing control of form, social interaction, patterns of use, and were very monocultural in their disposition. But what they did offer was a goal, an ambition, a sense of what the metropolis could be. These projects were idealized and totalizing, but their fault was not in articulating a big idea or a holistic ambition, but the assumption that to achieve their vision there needed to be complete bureaucratic, social, and formal control. So rather than the totalizing urbanism of Paul Rudolph's Lomex project, for us the value of design speculation is about the elucidation and staging of urban circumstances for activities and environments to occur. Urban latencies can be appropriated, activated, and charged through acts of design and scenario. And it should be noted that we're not trying to take all urban situations at face value, but rather a kind of projective perspective, imagining new and unexpected transformations and forms through the evaluation and engagement with existing conditions. So this is one more competition that was looking in the New York area. This is Jamaica Bay, and there's Gateway National Park, which is actually these three components across 2 states. It's an urban national park, essentially, and it kind of lacks a cohesive identity. So this competition was organized by the Van Allen Institute to try to understand how you could begin to create a cohesive identity for this national park. So we were looking at its unique kind of urban condition and ecological condition, and tried to think about the 20 existing types of national park, and perhaps propose a 21st type of national park, trying to play on the idea that all of the top 25 largest cities in our country are embedded in this unique ecology, and perhaps a 21st type of national park could begin to add a research component that's tried to understand the adjacency of an urbanized environment to its natural ecology. So we focused in on this Floyd Bennett Field area of the park in order to demonstrate our kind of approach to the project, which essentially takes the national park components of stewardship, recreation, education, and adds research as also a funding mechanism that could produce research areas, incubators, and so on that help support the funding and the operations and maintenance of the national parks, and that this is something that could be prototyped or introduced to other areas around the United States. Sorry about that.
Sorry. So just a sort of quick second example of that kind of thinking. There's a competition recently that was organized by the Royal Institute of British Architects to redesign the sort of iconic transmission tower in the UK landscape, and that seemed a kind of odd aspiration for us, because essentially it was aestheticizing a piece of infrastructure rather than radically rethinking it. So what we did is sort of put together a proposal that said, okay, we'll keep your infrastructure, we're going to bundle it with some other things and tie it to an existing network of highly fragmented ecological preserves within the country. So the idea was to essentially take the national grid and turn it into an ecological corridor by occupying the right-of-way within the easement of the transmission tower. There's a limited height, obviously a limited width, and the idea was to bundle that with the iconic image of the British hedgerow and reimagine what the hedgerow was in a kind of 21st century infrastructural configuration. So this is sort of your prototypical habitat area that emerges from the kind of figuration and shaping of the hedge into contexts that vary. In essence, rather than isolating the infrastructure, literally integrating it into varied urban contexts through the reconfiguration of a system that has a kind of historical significance within the British landscape. And the kind of significance economically as well as environmentally of what that would do in terms of what it's capable of consuming and reprocessing. And so the sort of third bit of this alternative mode of praxis is a kind of privileging of the public realm, which is really what distinguishes these projects from the kind of work of the early 20th century. And that is in a sense that those projects, the sort of antecedents to this type of work, were sort of dominated or driven by one of two systems, either mobility or housing, oftentimes at the expense of the other systems that were present. So beyond the familiar notions of environment and habitat, public realm, and preservation, what's most compelling for us about the idea of public realm as a primary organizing device of the urban landscape is in fact its resiliency, its capacity to synthesize and accommodate a variety of urban systems without losing its elemental identity or erasing their elemental identity. So conflicting systems such as mobility, recreation, sanitation, energy, and ecology can all be organized under an appropriately scaled and robust public realm armature that appropriates the byproducts of these systems in order to generate new hybrid forms of collective space specifically calibrated to a particular urban circumstance. This aspect of resiliency means moving beyond the notions of public realm as plazas, small places for collections, traditional landscape typologies, but considering it more as a figuring device at the scale of the metropolis, capable of organizing and influencing both what's within it and also what's at its edges or beyond. What's important to note about this reorientation is that whereas previous shifts in the systems that organized metropolitan landscapes tended to displace or cause the failure of the system that they were replacing, using the public realm as a driver of organization at the metropolitan scale actually allows for the integration of existing systems and the enhancement of them because they're bundled into a kind of matrix. So whereas the railway displaced water transport and the roadway displaced the railway as a driver of urbanizing formats, the public realm actually integrates those things rather than removing them.
Right. Okay, so this is a competition. We were looking at Helsinki's South Harbor. So this is the kind of existing configuration, and it's this large cruise ship terminal. It's a really infrastructural port still, not so much for containers, but it still has this really hard edge, and there's no public presence at the water. So we were asked to reimagine what this harbor could be as a kind of public realm for Helsinki. And what that meant was also trying to understand the complex loading and unloading logistics. These are actually not just cruise ships, but also ferries that take you all around, so you have to be able to load many cars on and off them constantly. So we began by burying the infrastructure and then producing this horseshoe or ring around the harbor based upon these different principles. So it's kind of an operational approach. We had step one, which was bury this service and local waterfront traffic to free up the road that goes around it right now is still filled with heavy trucks and very busy, so it was limiting the public's access to the water. So we wanted to try to bury that, and then step two is extending the city to the water, and then create this continuous, legible public waterfront area that we then animated through discrete landscape types around this horseshoe, and then provide generous, overscaled, bespoke urban furnishings, and then anchor it with these 4 cultural icons, including a museum, a new terminal building, what we're calling these civic steps or platform, and it's an artificial atoll. Let's see. So this is looking right at which part is this? North, west? Can't remember. Okay, so this is looking at, we're going to work our way around the horseshoe. So this is looking at the one end of the museum area, connecting back to the civic steps beyond. And then they really love bonfires in Helsinki. So this is our kind of New Year's event where you might have this large bonfire on the atoll. And then it works its way around toward this historic market building. This is looking back at the museum that anchors the one end with its kind of back to the logistical loading and unloading area. This is a kind of transformed historic market that already exists in this one area, but all of its loading and unloading is now underground and frees that area up for the public realm. This is looking back at the south end where the new terminal building is introduced and this new artificial landscape that raises up to connect with an existing park. These urban furnishings we're showing are a kind of take on the sauna, where you can sit on a bench that's warmed by sauna rocks and it's kind of steaming, keeping you warm and extending the seasons. and then these artificial rock outcroppings that are poking up through these really controlled ovals. You get these really kind of natural bursts through the area. And then this is our Finnish flag pool that you swim in all year round, but that you ice skate around in the wintertime as well.
So maybe the last bit of this, and perhaps the distinct bit, given the previous three examples, is this notion of public advocacy. So in essence, what we're arguing for is not an existing role of discipline, or the design disciplines, but actually an additional thing that we think design needs to take on as it relates to the conceptualization of territorial urban form. And that's actually arguing for the projects that we're proposing or putting out there. As has been noted sort of a number of times today, design has a certain ability to synthesize and visualize information and concepts that are otherwise dormant or misunderstood. And this ability to represent these ideas is an opportunity to kind of expand the efficacy of the discipline. And so in order for the sort of things that we're advocating here to have resonance and to work, we actually believe that designers need to become vocal and sort of visible advocates for the transformations that they're proposing. It's not enough to kind of map and document these things, but it's actually essential that we make propositions about their implementation and their engagement, and actually advocate those things in a public forum. Essentially, moving away from the idealistic or the utopian and actually engaging the hyper-pragmatic and opportunistically strategic. So this is all about conveying information as well as being able to argue for your work in a clear and sort of coherent form. And so this is actually the project that originally Jason invited us to present, which is looking at the Lower Cuyahoga Valley in Cleveland, essentially the sort of post-industrial heart of the city. And for those of you, I assume, are somewhat familiar with the city given your proximity to it, the issue with Cleveland is that the real estate and development and planning work that's been going on recently has all focused on sort of small-scale ad hoc interventions, the kind of shrinking cities movement, as well as the kind of conventional real estate projects that were noted above, and the city has ostensibly turned its back on the valley. And what's sort of striking about this is that the valley was the place that the kind of economic and political power of the city emerged from. So this was actually a proposition that we've put forward and have sort of engaged various local stakeholders, be they foundations or the planning agencies, both at the county and city level, about radically rethinking the city's orientation back towards the valley through a kind of procedure of integrated land use, not evacuating the industry, but actually tying the industry a bit like Dan was showing us earlier, with other uses in other programs. So the valley for us was a kind of fascinating place to work because it's smack dab in the middle of the city. It's not at the periphery. It has these sort of spectacular infrastructures, which we've seen quite a bit of today in other contexts. It's still working, and that was something that we wanted to maintain in terms of the work. Has these sort of striking vistas from its periphery where you can stand in sort of great neighborhoods but see the downtown. It's obviously a highly modified natural system, and that was something that sort of fascinated us, to sort of use that as the definition of the place to work, look at the natural system and how it's been changed, and use that as the extents rather than political boundaries. And the kind of alien landscape that it produces, sort of a fetishizing and fascination with that in some ways. But as you move south, a kind of composite begins to emerge, where the industry begins to also show these kind of emerging ecological areas. And it actually, what's so striking is that the adjacency is to a national park. So you have this highly modified, highly industrialized landscape that immediately turns into a national park. And when you get into that national park, you get these sort of very naturalistic, preserved landscapes that are immediately adjacent to this highly modified, still working, still operational center of the city. But it's something that the city and the population doesn't necessarily have a relationship with beyond the occasional failed entertainment venue. So the project itself was really about sort of taking these ideas of productive landscapes and regenerative urban landscapes and making them civic and sort of building up the ecology. So there's been a lot of work in the valley, and we sort of acknowledge that, but the work has all been isolated. It's been real estate based and development based. It's been recreation based, it's been ecological based, but there's never been a kind of holistic vision about what the valley could mean to the city. And so that was sort of what we were trying to put forth with this project. So basically what you have here is the kind of topographic figure of the valley within the city, not necessarily legible as you move through Cleveland, So our project really began by making that legible, making the valley a kind of central armature for which the city would continue to develop. We did that by essentially taking the escarpments and the ravines at the edges of it and reforesting it, in essence pulling the national park to the waterfront, and then beginning to think about how we can propose alternative land uses for that surface within that figure. These look agricultural, they're not intended to be that, they're intended to be a kind of range of land uses. And then what that would catalyze in terms of development at the edges of the valley itself. So you're talking about an area that's essentially 12,000 acres, which is 20% of the size of the city of Cleveland, becoming the kind of active catalyst and armature upon which the city reimagines itself, rather than these sort of small bits of intervention. And this wasn't about a kind of master plan, which is what this kind of shows, but an idea about reframing an opportunity within the city as a place to do work, rather than these sort of loose and non-related interventions. The idea was to put forth a holistic vision under which individual projects could emerge and actually be developed. So for us, it was really about sort of defining the 7 primary land uses, not from a geographic point of view, but from just a use point of view. So the notion that portions of the valley needed to be remediated and what that could begin to spatially look like. The idea that water is a sort of essential element within the city's identity, both between the lake and the river, and how we might tie recreation to that. The energy landscapes that would emerge between the industries that were in the valley, as well as the sort of notion of the Lake Erie wind farm that's been proposed, and actually using the valley as the infrastructural armature to manage those things. And the kind of landscapes, sort of potentially spectacular landscapes that something like that could produce, a kind of civic quality to these things, production as well, so that it wasn't about displacing, and it wasn't about sort of picking fights with stakeholders who are in the valley now, but thinking about a way that these things can be synthesized and hybridized so you create this sort of the adjacencies that in some ways Dan was outlining in the presentation before, at the scale of the city. Not just within the neighborhood, but literally a kind of spectacle that was both working, both ecological, both recreational, and both productive. And what that would mean for reframing how the city actually conceptualizes and thinks of itself. So if we were to return to the kind of original premise of what we are arguing for, after nearly half a century of neglect, there's emerged a kind of glaring vacancy in the development and articulation of territorial scale physical planning, particularly as it relates to the creation and advocacy of visionary metropolitan scale initiatives. This vacancy is a result of both an abandonment of a discipline as well as disciplinary failures. And the deficiency has created a sense of stagnation and repetition within the American city that is such we're at a time where design, with a recalibrated focus on leveraging existing systems rather than generating novel form, has the opportunity to reclaim an essential disciplinary role as it relates to the shaping of the urban landscape. If we can utilize a focus on the latent potentials embedded within an established format of urbanization, leverage design speculation that is concentrated on the public realm as an instrument of organization, and publicly disseminate and advocate the potential of these initiatives, we believe that this alternative mode of praxis can actually begin generating opportunities for design to take on a cultural leadership role, placing it in a forward position in relationship to the broader conversation regarding the future of the American urban landscape. Thanks.
I don't want to get too close. Okay, that's it. Thanks. Okay. I think where I'm going to start, maybe surprisingly, is back with Jane Jacobs. Recently, trying to figure out how in the world I was going to try to talk intelligently about economics across 3 presentations that I was guessing may not have a lot linking them, I started looking around on the bookshelf a little bit and came across The Nature of Economies, which is a book that Jane Jacobs wrote in the late 90s. And one of the things that she does in there, most of what she's trying to do is demonstrate how economies adhere to these kinds of universal natural logics, right? A lot of it has to do with dynamic or nonlinear systems. And one of the things that she talks about that I think is relevant, certainly for Dan and Port, is the notion of diversification. And so she talks about something like an organization like a rainforest, and how a rainforest is able to kind of endlessly diversify its energy inputs, right? And so you get this really rich and heterogeneous mix from the top of the canopy basically down into the soil, right? And so it's a kind of pragmatic approach, right? And I think that there's a kind of connection there with what Port talked about, I think, as a kind of waste capitalization, I guess you could call it, right? If we want to try to bring this back to more economic terms. So I guess what interests me is the potential then for design to start to take on a larger role in this diversification process, right? And I think it's easy. Some of the examples they gave us, Cleveland, the salt terminal where there is actually kind of unused or underutilized space, right? There's a kind of inefficiency there that we can capitalize on. So I guess what I was hoping that maybe you guys could talk about a little bit more is, given that the country's got certainly in post-industrial cities, right? Detroit, North St. Louis, Cleveland, several landscape resources available to us that need this kind of diversification, right? That are basically wide open to us. Why is very little happening in those areas, right? And if you could just maybe speculate a little bit about how your approach might translate into those areas. I mean, you obviously talked about Cleveland, but I think going beyond that and starting to think about how do we engage these economies in such a way that we are actually spurring new development in maybe a more traditional economic sense as opposed to maybe an ecological sense. Whoever. I'll come back to one that hopefully brings Ben into the discussion in a minute.
I mean, in some ways, I think the notion of diversification even needs to go on to the idea of the stakeholder, because I think in a lot of cases, what I think is interesting about sort of the landing studio presentation is that design is directly engaged with a client who is trying to, in essence, reach out to the stakeholders who are affected by what it is that they're doing. I would say in the case of a lot of these cities that the problem is that you can't get everyone in the same room to understand what it is that they're doing and how it might benefit somebody else. So the assumption is that if you're in industrial processes, you're producing a byproduct that nobody wants to be around, and that there's not actually an opportunity for school children or community groups to actually engage in that sort of thing. And so I think some of that has to do with just the way that planning and sort of political organization within cities works. There isn't the ability for these seemingly disparate groups to actually have a conversation. So where this kind of work seems to happen is when those conversations get produced, where you get the kind of the seemingly oppositional both in a room to start to think about how they could share resources or potentially share a shared agenda, if you will, in some way. So in the case of the Cuyahoga Valley project, I mean, it's come down to issues like material storage yards, really sort of explaining to people that it's not dormant, it's not vacant, it's not abandoned, but in fact these are working places and that they have certain requirements that they need to maintain, and beginning to explain to the kind of the neighborhood group that they're actually looking for these sort of occasions by which to integrate. And so it really is about getting them into the same place. And I think once you kind of get the sort of seemingly oppositional into the same place to have those conversations, then you can begin to speculate on those overlaps. And it's at that point of overlap where I think the possibilities exist. And so this is kind of what we were getting at with the notion of, I think as designers, there's this real fascination in mapping and documenting and indexing certain situations, and we do a great deal of that, but we don't necessarily operate on that mapping or operate on that indexing. And I think in terms of that conversation, if we begin to speculate within those things that we've documented, we can begin to demonstrate the kind of potential overlap and the sort of shared agendas that these seemingly oppositional groups would have with one another.
Work? Yes.
I think you need that, man.
Oh, good. I'm going to hold it down here. I guess just one thing, I like that you had that slide of that Minneapolis bridge collapse. That is very sort of near and dear to a lot of issues we deal with. That was sort of a really horrible moment, because obviously the Tappan Zee Bridge, I think you referred to the horrible imminent disaster that's coming, that's going to fall. The horrible imminent disaster actually already happened because of that bridge collapse. I think a number of people, of course, died in that bridge collapse. The crazy thing that happened is essentially overnight they went across the United States, Boston, New York, Baltimore, and they immediately changed all the allowable truck weights on all those bridges. So that literally, in the case of New York City, every single bridge went from a 105,000 pound weight limit to an 80,000 pound weight limit. So now, when you just remove the weight of the truck itself, you've literally cut the capacity of trucks in half. So in the case of the salt industry, that was a huge economic hit. All the contracts had to be rewritten with all the public works agencies. The World Trade Center, construction project, its concrete budget for transportation of concrete into Manhattan essentially doubled. And then, of course, the horrific part of that is the environmental, footprint of that. And what it comes down to is a lot of these kind of the diversification. Right? I think that was sort of the origin of the question, right? Manhattan has allowed itself to become completely undiversified, and most of New York for that matter, in terms of transportation efficiencies, right? Like once upon a time, they received ships, barges, trains, and trucks. So when all of a sudden this disaster happened with the trucking infrastructure, there's no ability to all of a sudden say, hey, no, put it back on barges. Now we're in good shape with barges. We're just stuck with really crappy truck transit. And the irony of that is the irony is it's actually gotten so bad that now when you're in sort of public agency meetings in New York, they are reevaluating barging into the city. And the irony of that is they go around the shores looking for facilities now to, let's say, send trash out and bring salt in. I've been at numerous, or get demolition debris out. And there's honestly very few facilities. And the majority of them are parks and they're condominiums, and that infrastructure all existed. Now, so it kind of goes to but what's cool is they're actually now trying to reevaluate the ability to open barge docks. So in a way, the economy got so bad, the system got so bad that they now are evaluating better tactics. It's just incredibly hard because there's such legislative, like one of the most complicated ones we deal with is in New York City, they have very strict guidelines for daylighting over waterways, right? Casting shadows on the bottom of shores. And those are sort of really great legislative efforts because they don't want you casting shadows on the sea bottom in order to, because it kills sea life. You're not going to grow things when it's completely dark and dank down there. But I guess from my perspective, when we work with things like dry dock companies, like how do you build a dry dock? How do you build a sled dry dock that they have limitations that you can't have a barge in place anywhere for a longer period than 13 days? So there's these types of legislations that have been sort of enacted over time that have led to sort of the demise of a number of infrastructures, not because they weren't efficient, they sort of fell out of favor and we didn't preserve those capacities. And they're very much not sort of tactical, right? They're very sort of overarching. The entire waterfront has to operate this way. So when people want to build a condominium park, they are enacted by that type of legislative restriction. And when they want to build a dry dock, they're up against that. So the reality is New York doesn't build dry docks. So the shipping industry goes away because there's no ability to repair your vessels. They have to send them to places like Baltimore. The Staten Island ferries now go to Connecticut to be repaired. I mean, that kind of efficiency is insane, large to be. So it really comes to just, I think, analyzing the nature of specific programs, specific uses of the waterfront. And as much as we've talked about large-scale planning strategies, there has to be a real tactical sensitivity. Not everything on the waterfront can operate the same way under the same rules, for example.
Well, I think that helps. I was a little bit, at first I was a little uncertain specifically, Dan, of your critique of the High Line, say, right? Because it seemed that you use similar experiential design ideas in your own park. But I guess it makes a little bit more sense now when you're saying that thinking more strategically about it, it's not about the end use as much as keeping the end use open and available to future programs that we may not quite know we need yet, right? So when you're talking about the coast being just parks now, and now unavailable to some of the uses that you think, industrial uses that could be coming back or that we may need in the future, we've precluded that from happening.
Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of like that park development that we're working on, part of again, what we've tried to work with the state and city agencies, they have a lot of code and laws. We've actually had to change state laws to make this project even possible. That's part of it. We spent 18 months lobbying the governor, to actually change a law, and he changed the law. It worked out because he came to sort of understand some of the absurdity of these regulations. But what you end up happening, we look at that facility, the state says you literally cannot build anything other than maritime and industrial operations in designated port areas, because they saw what was happening to Boston. They saw that the efficiency of the city was getting undermined by the economy of things like condominium developments. There's no way a salt dock can compete economically with a developer on a condominium. It just doesn't happen. So they get sort of bought out. They get pushed out. The consequence is then literally you're trucking everything from Port Newark, which that's a problem. They created the designated port areas as a very rigid zoning strategy. And most cities have sort of enacted those types of legislations. The city, meanwhile, says we don't want maritime industries. So they come up with really tough zoning strategies, right, that say, like literally they don't allow any maritime industrial operations within their zoning code. So I think what we've worked with them to do is take a property, we have 13 acres at the salt dock, dissect the property, understand how there's different components that have limitations because of, let's say, underground utilities, cross-channel utilities, that can't support maritime industrial functions. So then we can work with the state to say, well, that's a limitation. It has an industrial function. It's bringing drinking water to East Boston. Why don't we combine that piece with a park? And literally, it's still operated by the industry. It's still a piece of the industry, but it's actually sort of taken out of industrial operation and then opened for community operations.
Ben, do you have any comment on the diversification issue? Does that make any sense to you as far as something that you'd comment on from your perspective?
I think it's really interesting how these two different presentations kind of dealt with the different scales at which sort of diversification of use and creating hybrids and finding sympathies between different programs can actually happen. But I guess the other part of that I would propose that maybe we participate in is that where these guys are sort of identifying opportunities or using some agency to assemble things together to create opportunities. I think there's another way in which maybe CLUI works, which is through simple demystification of the landscape that allows other people to see sympathetic uses and create them on their own outside of the realm of what we would consider to be, design.
Yeah. I think this is a good question. It prompts an interesting question that I've been thinking about all day, which has to do with medium. It seems like, I think back to an essay by Corner, which was called Projection and Disclosure, and he was talking about, the idea that drawing and communicating was central to what landscape architects did. Stan Allen wrote something similar, which talked about architects, creating a set of documents, but not really having control over the actual physical construction of the building. And so I think, it seems like today in Jeanette's work and in several of the presentations that we could almost start to talk about an image economy, right? And think of it in the sense of, start to, I guess, rethink very seriously the medium that we typically work in, right? Because I think there is, for probably both disciplines, I know you guys are all architects, is that right? Yeah. So architects and landscape architects being my point, there's still a kind of perception, mythology, that we deal with a certain media, right? And that allows us to obtain certain effects. So I don't know if and I think it's in all of your projects, certainly, right? Port, with your kind of strategic visualizations, and like you said, trying to build consensus and help people understand what the project might lead to. Dan, in some of your work, it was even, like the literal imaging or putting an image on the salt pile, right, to make it more acceptable to people. So I don't know if you guys want to talk a little bit about the way you think about media today, if you do.
No? Okay, all right, it's fine. I think for us, recently, the last two projects that two of the last few projects we worked on, we've actually produced videos for the projects. And they're both, we didn't show either of them today, but they're both on our website. But we found that process beyond, researching, conceiving an idea, producing the drawings, laying out a kind of graphic presentation, we found that constructing the narrative and having to distill information into consecutive bite-sized pieces for someone over 9 minutes, taking the complexities of 12,000 acres of Cleveland and trying to explain where the point of entry is into that project and what the goals are, and then visualizing that as you're giving information. It's been a really I think great exercise for us and something that we want to continue doing. It's a whole separate issue to rather than thinking about your graphic presentation, but how you create a visual timeline of how you walk someone through every kind of what's at stake at the project. And I think that was back when we were talking about public advocacy of our projects. We've actually gotten a lot of mileage out of these videos as well, that you're not putting up a kind of architectural board for someone to see, but that we have this online, or that these presentations can actually present our projects when we're not there. And that it's not just a few slides that you can flip through on a site, but that you can listen to. For the Cleveland project, for example, is a 9.5-minute narrated, presentation. So,
Just to add slightly to that, I think, the sort of work that Ben and Matt are doing to kind of just get people out there and see these things, the kind of, as you said, the sort of documentation that Jeanette was showing, all of that stuff has resonance, and I think it has potential, but then again, the question is, how do you engage with that sort of thing? So I think it is essential to just sort of expose these seemingly opaque ideas and distill them down into sort of digestible factoids. And some people would say, well, that's oversimplification, you're missing all of the nuance of it. But the reality is that if you don't at least expose to the set of circumstances a kind of a constituency, that constituency will never be there. And so that's what I think is sort of fascinating about the work that in essence, the other two groups in the panel are doing, and sort of everyone else today, is that they're taking issues that are super impactful, super complex, but they're putting them in a package that's consumable. And I think we as designers, and I'm going to generalize here, we as designers for a very long time haven't done a very good job of that. And I think it's actually a kind of essential thing, and that if we don't learn to be very good at conveying sort of the complexities of what we're trying to do, and sort of stop talking in particular ways, we're going to continue to lose the agency and the efficacy of design. And so I feel like it's an essential thing. I think this ability to kind of clearly, rationally make an argument, expose a constituency to a situation that's sort of missing or latent, should be the basis of our work. In essence, to really create support and build momentum for what these things that we see as sort of essential facts of our urban environment.
Beat a dead horse or something. To me, there's something about being very tactical that's just very missing from a lot of sort of conversations, and really getting very sort of specifically embedded. And that's why I've sort of enjoyed getting very involved with the salt industry, and it's given me a lot of insights into other industries which we now work with. But the point is like they're all very different. And it's something I always watch. One of the things that I think we've gotten involved in a lot is actually even kind of re-engineering and working with engineers on these like dock facilities and things, because there's like new status quos for how these types of facilities are even built. So, and that's often played out because in the case of port development, for example, they want to consolidate all of that infrastructure into one location so that a scrap metal pile is treated the same as a salt pile. And the irony of that is they actually function entirely differently. Like salt is a highly hydroscopic material. It absorbs water. Its drainage patterns and its stormwater, protection, stormwater pollution prevention plans are entirely different than, you know, a scrap metal yard's. Yet the legislation, again, that's sort of enacted the way ports are designed nowadays is it's supposed to either accommodate one or the other, and they can be both. And a container terminal can be switched over for a salt pile, and that's typically what's happening in cities still. And the problem there is just, and something we just look at is, I think it's honestly because a lot of people haven't taken the time to actually look at these facilities very specifically, very nuanced, come up with a palette of design. And I think it is sort of a giant missing gap in the kind of design industry, is people really investigating these facilities sort of on the ground in their exact operative characteristics. And so then that speaks to a larger kind of engineering scenario. And then I think from a more sort of creative, or what first got us interested as designers, was reading a lot of Corner and the notion of mapping, the understanding that mapping remakes an architecture. You have to sort of remap it. And really figuring out what are the opportunities. So in the case of the salt industry, it's highly seasonal, right? So then in the summer months, it's not, it's not active. So that's a great kind of community partnership, right? Because then the public can inhabit that land in the summer. Every industry has those kind of characteristics that are then opportunistic, right? And I think it's really a matter of first doing sort of the large scale planning exercise of looking at a region, and then really taking the time, to have a sort of a living, I think in the history where architects, designers worked with these industries, Ledoux, Barons, they worked for their careers with these industries. They didn't come in, do a project, and leave. It's sort of a change, and it's odd. Then we've hit a sort of a series of generations that industries were just honestly not designed. They became the realm of engineers who honestly do kind of, they're just the way they work. I don't know why, is pretty quick projects. They build the infrastructure, and it's not about designing the life of the industry, where someone like Ledoux and Barons were a perpetual designer. They were sort of an on-staff, and I think that is a sort of a typology of designer that is what we try and be, where we establish our client relations and continue it. And I think it should be a more, more people should do that.
Bought him cigars.
Tell you the honest truth. I will tell you the honest truth. I mean, it's a fun story. I always like telling it because I really like that guy. And so the honest truth is I went in as a graduate student after doing the light projections. They had just purchased the oil terminal. They thought what I had done with the projections was funny. They enjoyed it. They thought it was funny, and it was cheap. And I went in with a proposal. I made a whole series of documents of the development of the oil terminal, and I laid out a strategy, essentially saying, hey, I think we could work with the community. There are things the community wants. I put a little magazine together, went in. I asked them for $2,500 a month to work for a period. The guy laughed. He wrote me a check for $10,000 and told me to come back and see him in a month. And that was the sort of literal start of my relationship with him. The irony to that is I find the people, I have honestly felt that my education has incredibly amplified the sort of second I started working with them. They have an unbelievable team of lawyers. They have an unbelievable team of lobbying, and that's a word that's used very negatively. They had an interesting PR group that was very ineffective at the time, who I've essentially replaced in terms of actually doing more actual work with the company. And I mean, these are people who have traveled the world establishing facilities. They know exactly what they need. They know the laws. They often just, I think they're just I don't know any other facilities who have kind of on-staff, constant designers sort of work, other than like really big facilities, you know, like Ford or something like this. But I think they've found it a very productive relationship, and while they might not have known that's what they've needed, I've definitely found that, at least in the 6 years I've worked for them, our kind of participation with them has only grown and grown and grown, to the point that you know, things that used to be handled by lawyers, things that used to be handled by essentially very superficial PR relationships, sort of more of a, I think the number one thing that they've gravitated to is don't be retroactive, don't be reactionary, like be proactive. Like the worst situation for these industries, for these operations is, you know, a community group, a school group, different things come in and they come up with a vision for the waterfront of Staten Island, you know, and it's this great thing, it's all parks, it's all condominiums, that's something we sort of, and it completely obliterates the industry, that's sort of pretty prototypical, and they say it's post-industrial time, you know, and the industries are gone, and I think where the industries are more productive is if they come through the gates, knowing, they know what the community wants, they've heard it for decades, they come up with their own plan, they work with the community to tune that plan and tune that development, and I think that's now their kind of new philosophy, and I think they very quickly gravitated to a proactive mentality like that.
Andrew, when you were doing the video and you described working through that narrative, what were some of the discoveries that you made as you were doing that, and what were some of the things that seemed to be often the most profound?
It's the way we already know how to draw. Like what we found was that a lot of the video, especially the first one we did, where it was really the steep learning curve, it was really graphic. It wasn't narrated, so there was we relied very heavily on our graphics, and it was the idea that we were doing a drawing that we would work 20 layers into it so that we could unpack and animate and explain the drawing as it kind of built itself. As opposed to the idea of maybe let's imagine a slideshow where you kind of turn something on and you see something new each time. We were doing drawings that had to literally reveal and unfold and animate. And that was, we worked with a really talented, well, he's trained as an architect, but Richie Gellis is his name. He's very talented. He really helped us out with using After Effects and being able to unpack a lot of these drawings that we'd previously only done for 2 dimensions. So I think that was a big part of thinking through how to convey that information, but in a very, like 1 minute, you might spend 1 minute unpacking one drawing, if that makes sense, but still just one file that you've been working on this whole time.
Your point about the audience, I think, is the essential point, right? Because you have to, I mean, in some ways, because the conversation has been within the walls of discipline, within the walls of academia, you've gotten to the point of talking about our work in a certain way. The reality is when we're talking about any of these projects, when you go up in front of a mayor who has a minute and a half to make a decision, you have to be able to get the whole thing out there in a kind of efficient process. And so I think it should radically change how we conceptualize drawing. There's technical drawing, which is sort of, this is how you put it together. And then there's also the drawing this is what the sort of strategy is, and this is what the tactic is, and how quickly can you digest that? I think is really important. I think, I mean, it's kind of the thing that you know, with the sort of ascension of the diagram within design, and that's what that's pushing towards. And so there's some people who say, again, it's oversimplification. You're sort of eroding out critical aspects of it. But I would argue in order to get to the conversation, in order to kind of embed ourselves into the discourse that is shaping these landscapes that we're looking at over the last 2 days, if you're not able to get in quickly, it's hard to justify your contribution.
Yeah, just one more point about that. It's just the idea that, especially the project we were working on, which a lot of us are working at that scale, we needed to, within 1 minute, get to the idea of a large-scale underwater tunnel, CO2 sequestering, floating algae pier. And we can actually show it and break it apart faster than we can explain it, and it's visual. So it's been really great, I think.
We could have sent that for maybe.
Yeah, we could have shown 2 videos, but we decided to talk a bunch.
I guess just the last point, because I'm just thinking about your question still. I mean, the other point I just want to make, because I didn't have a chance to make it, I am very interested in urban capacity. I just want to know how much a piece of land can do for the city, how productive we can ask it to be. And so one component of that is sort of the physical manifestation of that land on the ground. The other component of that is, of course, the population associated with that. And one of the things that I find is just an overlooked and a sort of sadly overlooked aspect, and just as an anecdote, the first time I went on that facility, the guy who greeted me was hanging up the phone. I had to sit for 5 minutes, and the conversation he was having was a coal ship had sunk off the coast of England, and they were asking him to bring out a series of barges and cranes to mine the coal out of the sunken freighter. You know, and you're sitting there being like, that's unbelievable. And he was like, I'm not coming, I'm tired. He was like, it's a waste of my time. Like, get someone else, get someone in England. I'm not bringing my stuff over. I mean, it's sort of like, and you just quickly realize, like, we have an amazing capacity. These infrastructures are built. The idea, I mean, when I see these, I think, you know, like the people who would actually look at something like Tobias is design for Long Island, you show that to some of these industry guys and they're like, yeah. It's like, we could do that. That's not hard. I mean, that's the idea of they have such an inherent capacity. I mean, you're talking about people who discharge 50,000 tons of salt. Just they show up to work and they do that. And it's just like, so for me, I mean, I always, like we talk about videos and things, I'm like, oh, what, you know, maybe we could get an aerial photo of this happening. They pick up the phone, they call the Coast Guard. By the end of the day, they have an aerial photograph of what you wanted to see. Like, there's an enormous untapped capacity and resource, and the amount of stagnation that exists in the legislative level that prevents us from capitalizing on that is very frustrating. Because, you know, and I always look at it when people talk about like energy conversion of the country, the industrialists, I often feel, are the people who sit back just kind of like, we could, you know, that can happen. They are not the people who have a hard time reading hydrographic surveys. They don't have a hard time reading architectural plans for developing mines in Chile. You know, it's a whole different population who are standing. So that's one of the things I've enjoyed working with this group. I actually find that the majority of things we propose, buildings and landscapes, moving domes around to build a park, they're just like, oh, I'll get my crane guy, just let me know when you want to do it. And it's a luxury to work with people with that mentality. And then, honestly, you walk into City Hall, and that's where you, I think the capacity is there. We have to sort of strip some of that hurdles.
Jeanette, you had a question?
I wanted to ask you guys about, I basically just wanted to put the word opportunism on the table and just talk about it a bit, and just to see how you guys take it on. And Dan, I think your enthusiasm is the kind of craziness of earth moving is just so infectious. And I think for all of you guys, it seems that the kind of super bizarre connections that you make in your opportunistic thinking is just so extraordinary. And then at the same time, I also wonder, is there ever a time when seizing opportunities that the market allows doesn't work? Are there times where opportunism is applicable and times where it's not so effective? Are there ever times where the market doesn't work? Or are there ever times, referring to back to Laura's stuff, are there ever times where one needs to protest rather than be opportunistic?
The answer is yes. Think of an example. Phrase it a slightly different way. Like, what do you mean by not being opportunistic? Because I'm not.
Well, it seems like all of you are, sorry, I'm like categorizing you and putting you on my map right now. But I think that all of you are opportunistic thinkers, that you're not setting out to change the kind of privatized world that we live in, that you're seizing upon the opportunities of that existing system to alter it, to change it, to celebrate it, to exacerbate it. And that's what I guess.
I think maybe the way of putting it is, are there times that you feel like then you have to go outside the system, right? Because what you're doing, which I think is hugely important, is trying to find the opportunities inside the system. That's it.
Yeah.
Well, it's definitely hard. Like, for me, I mean, I remember when I started this work, a lot of people were very anti being involved with the salt industry, that you become a pawn of the industry just because you work for it, which I think is a sort of weird conception. I remember someone once calling me Halliburton, which was weird. It was very aggressive. And so, because I'm just getting at, when I started the project, I looked at it as, I was a graduate student, there was this asphalt batching terminal in Chelsea. There was a weak moment where El Paso Oil abandoned all of its terminals in Boston Harbor. There was this horrific asphalt batching facility that they ran in Chelsea, which was a huge carcinogen. You know, they have to heat asphalt, they have to keep it in a constant, so it's very fumy, it smells horrible, leads to very bad respiratory illnesses, et cetera. So I saw, my initial thought on this project was that I was going to sneak my way in and eliminate this asphalt terminal as a way of working with the salt company, who I knew had certain interests. So I had this sort of devious sort of second condition of how I saw it. And then more and more the way that, you know, when I started working with them, I sort of realized that they had this very fundamental value, like going to working waterfront conferences and things like that. There's a whole nother side, you know, you go to certain conferences that are about greening the waterfront, new recreation, et cetera, and then there's a whole nother group of people in the world who are all about looking at regional sustainability through transportation and the demise of our infrastructure systems. And so I quickly realized that it had nothing to do, I mean, yes, asphalt is, you know, it's great, it's going away, but that there was a sort of more complex, interesting issue of trying to balance these infrastructural concerns. And so in the sense of, for example, I mean, you know, I was dismayed for a little while in the project that there seemed to be a period when we were not making any headway with the city, and I actually knew that the owners of the property were in conversation with an oil company to reactivate the terminal for oil distribution again. And I was very sort of just depressed by that, because while that's those kind of moments where you just feel very trapped because of your relationship, you know, it's like, I was sitting there, my goal has always been to be an advocate for the city through working with the industry. And all of a sudden, in my, you know, one side of my brain, I'm sitting there thinking, like, you're seeing a meeting and I can't say anything to the community, like, listen, like, watch out what you do, because plan B is not looking so good for this terminal. You know, I mean, the company has this lined up, ready to go. If we can't, in the next 6 months, make this happen, like, the only thing that was permitted because of this legislative issue is the grandfathered allowance for it to become an oil terminal again. So economically, it would have been a snap to just open it again as an oil terminal. It was mothballed, it was fully licensed, it was ready to go. And so you're in this situation where you feel very conflicted. Economically, there was a moment when it would have been very efficient to just become an oil terminal. And, you know, I was just happy that we were able to kind of, and you're also put in the very awkward position where there were times in the negotiation with the city where you had to delicately talk about that issue. You don't want to blackmail the city and say, hey, listen, you know, it's going to be an oil terminal if you don't do what this company is saying to do. I mean, that's an awkward form of blackmail, right? And so how you navigate that as a designer is awkward, right? And I was just very happy it didn't go that route, because, I mean, that's when all of a sudden I really love working with the salt company, but you have to even ask, like, I mean, I'm not going to help you do that. That's exactly what I was trying to eliminate, you know?
maybe what we're talking about now is these two slices, right? And it seems like, Dan, maybe it's like you and your wife, you've got like the technical, and like you're saying, there's like the person who does the technical, but then there's this other role that either the research or in our role as practitioners, we're doing this, it's like the persuasive, the negotiation, we're playing this kind of more political role. And I just wonder if you guys can talk about that a little bit, and like, you know, it's like, that doesn't quite seem what we were trained for. I don't know if you feel that way, and so how do you think about that as we're moving forward in this passion?
I would almost say that the shift for us into that sort of type of work was running up against it, right? So like if you're sort of the conventional design practice, the way projects are sort of developed, publicly approved, the whole process, that you get maybe a little frustrated, right, by what's going on. And I think that frustration led to this idea of, your question, Jeanette, about opportunistic, that's a kind of funny word, right? Because it could be pejorative, like they're so opportunistic, right? Or it's actually a really good thing. Or I mean, I think you could replace it with entrepreneurial or activist. And I think it's all about trying to position yourself so that someone used the term earlier today, greedy. I mean, in some ways, I think we are all trying to capture a little bit more in terms of our role within the city, within the sort of urbanized landscape. That's what we do, right? I mean, we're trying to shape it in some ways. And I think there's a certain segment of design and planning that, isn't, sort of denies that fact. But at the end of the day, I mean, that's what we're trained to do, is shape the urban landscape. And so I think it's just looking for those moments to get more leverage in order to do that. And I know that sounds crass and that sounds a little bit direct, but I mean, I think at the end of the day, we are trying to find the moments within which we can actually intervene. Whether it's physically intervening or whether it's protesting, sitting down, whatever it is. And I think that the search for that is the kind of essence of the discipline and what we're doing. And this idea that we wait for the client to come and ask us to do something, being super responsive, it's sort of sowing your own fate, right? I mean, I think we have to get away from the waiting for and sort of return to the projective and put things out on the table.
All right, thanks.